Hey y'all, Mac here. This is going to be my Crit Hexblast Blood Mage full build guide. I decided to push this character to as strong as I deemed necessary. I do believe that it's able to take on most of the content in the end game, barring some of those extremely scarce bosses that I just can't seem to find. But that's kind of a separate issue in and of itself. The build itself is able to kill map bosses pretty easily, pretty quickly, with Delirium layers on top. And it's been able to actually do Sanctum as well, if anybody's interested in that. It's actually not a bad build for it, so long as you have the mana sustain for it, the last boss. But nonetheless, let's get into it. So overall, there's a little bit of flexibility here, but due to Hexblast having a base crit chance of 7%, if you're going to play crit variant, which I don't see why you wouldn't on Blood Mage, you're going to want to take Sunder the Flesh, because this is more than doubles our base crit chance for Hexblast, which allows us to scale crit damage as our primary DPS. So first and foremost, Sanguimancy have to take this node. It just literally tacks on a life cost to the skill. More importantly, you drop health orbs whenever you crit enemies or whenever you kill enemies. And in the map, these allow you to overcap your life by double what your life is. And when combined with Grim Feast, it becomes a huge defensive layer that we mostly rely on in mapping. I'm taking Vitality Siphon because this just allows us to sustain our life pool on bosses. That way I don't have to basically pray that I don't run out of flasks. I can kind of just hit the boss and only worry about managing my mana flask. The alternative is you can actually take either the Bleed, which I don't think is very good at all. It's just a little bit extra fizz damage. Highly discouraging this, but you still can. Or Grasping Wounds, which is essentially Progenesis for anyone who played PoE 1. And that's pretty solid, but at the same time, I don't think it's necessary because most of your life lost with this setup is going to come from basically life cost from your skills. And your Energy Shield acts as a very big sponge for damage prior to losing all your life. Obviously, crit damage per 40 life means we want to stack a decent bit of life, but there's just not a lot of space on gear to allow us to stack insane amounts. On top of that, there's not really life nodes on the tree, except maybe this one over here and a couple other ones that are much farther away, so I wouldn't worry too much about stacking as much life. Instead, because there's a lot of ES nodes, that's probably going to be your best way to actually scale. Alright, so first and foremost with the tree, you're going to be taking a lot of damage nodes on the tree, specifically crit. So I have almost every proximal crit node on this side of the tree, and I think you want to take as much as possible and basically get your crit chance as close to 100 as possible and crit damage up as much as possible too. I'd say once you hit around the 80%, you can start really going into crit damage bonus. But before that, getting some crit chance is always going to be good. Since we don't really have PoB to kind of test and see which one is better, the tooltip acts as a decent sort of decent indicator of how much damage you have, but it's not really super accurate. I wouldn't take it for gospel. The crit chance that I have right now is kind of insane. It took a lot of scaling through jewels, and so the jewels that I have are actually going to be max ES crit chance. Some of these have crit damage on them, and chaos damage, so any sort of percent multiplier, increased multiplier of chaos or spell damage. This is also a way for me to scale my ES, which is a massive part of my defensive layer. Area of effect of curses is pretty important, just so you can actually click things at the edge of your screen. You only really need one or two of these, roughly around 20% is all you need. I just take a bunch extra so I don't really get hit by anything off screen, which honestly can also be replaced with more damage if you are doing more single target stuff. Finally, there's one mod, recover 2% of mana on kill, that you really want. So besides that, I'm taking nodes in ES and chaos damage. You can see there's some curse nodes as well. I wouldn't really go into spaghettification, it's not really worth it. And you can do effective curses if you want. It's not a bad way to scale more damage, but I decided I needed to opt for more ES. These three nodes right here are pretty efficient for scaling your ES. I just decided to go for a jewel to get a little bit more damage. And beyond that, you want Arcane Surge and maybe some AoE and some additional ES scaling. ES's stun threshold is also pretty important, but I actually did end up getting a belt to compensate for that stun threshold. Alright, so quickly, abilities. I'm taking Clarity and Cannibalism, so mana's always an issue with most builds. You're going to want mana regen if possible. Cannibalism is insane for mapping, and so this is definitely going to be priority over Vitality. As you can see, I don't even have Vitality, so I don't really regen, but the Spell Leech as life kind of solves that problem. Our main skill, Hexblast, I have Magnified Effect, Chaos Mastery, Arcane Tempo, Inspiration, and Considered Casting. If I had to pick which one to get rid of, I would probably get rid of either Chaos Mastery or Arcane Tempo, but you 100% need Inspiration, Considered Casting, and either Magnified Effect for mapping or Concentrated Effect for bossing. And I have a gem swap that I will do for single target by just swapping Concentrated and Magnified on my Hexblast. For Contagion, all you really need is Chaotic Freeze and Persistence. This allows our damage from Hexblast to freeze our targets so long as Contagion is active. Thus, we just want a little bit more skill duration so we don't have to keep reapplying it. Dark Effigy is kind of annoying. It only hits things that are affected by Contagion or any other dot. And so I only place it down on like bosses. And I just get as much Wither on it as possible. And Envenom and Acceleration. Grim Feast allows us to overcap our energy shield. Whenever we kill enemies, we gain energy shield when we collect their remnants. And this allows us to overcap to around 8.3k ES, which is a massive defensive layer. On top of that, we're gaining a lot of stun threshold from that, so as your ES goes down, do be aware that you're going to become squishier and more prone to getting stunned. Withering Presence just adds more Wither faster, that way you don't have to be sitting on a boss for too long to actually apply maximum Wither. And our Blasphemy setup is utilizing 2 curses. So we are running Whispers of Doom, which allows us to apply an additional curse. And we're running Temp Chains and Despair. Temp Chains will allow Contagion to stick around longer on bosses. And then it's also going to just be a nice defensive layer as enemies' action speeds are slowed by 28%. I'm also taking Ritualistic Curse for more AoE and Heightened Curse for Curse Effect. Eye of Winter is also one additional thing that you can use to apply Critical Weakness, which basically just gives you more crit chance. I don't really use this much anymore because I have almost 100% crit chance, but if you're sitting at around 80% crit chance, popping an Eye of Winter before you start bursting down the boss with Hexblast is pretty important and can boost your damage by quite a bit. Alright, so next up, the items for this build are actually pretty flexible. There's a couple requirements, I'd say. So for your wand, you shouldn't really go for +5 if I'm being dead honest. You're going to run into mana cost issues. I'm able to sustain it with a lot of investment into mana regen and max mana. But if you have lower max mana, I would just opt for +4 and more importantly, get high crit chance. If you can hit over 100% crit, the highest tier, that would be ideal. But otherwise, running anywhere above 90% is pretty solid. On top of that, if you get spell or chaos damage, it's icing on the cake, and mana regen, of course, is always a good stat. Cast speed is also a good stat. The key unique for this build is going to be at Xeri's Disdain. This gives us 30% of our max life as max ES, and the only downside is that we take 20% of the damage to our life instead of our ES. However, with enough Spell Leech and a decent life pool, we're able to sort of mitigate this effect just a tiny bit. The gain max life as ES is seemingly functioning differently than PoE 1, so instead of applying after your percent increase effects are taking place, this gain max life as ES is added before your percent increases, meaning your actual percent increase maximum energy shield from your tree and from jewels actually applies to this base amount, which is huge. And actually, if I take this off, I'm at 1.6k ES. With the sun, I'm at 4.1k. So yeah, it's a massive item. Probably our biggest defensive layer. The focus, you really just want a lot of damage on it, ES and crit. The cast speed and reses are as needed, but crit is almost completely necessary, and you want a little bit of ES if possible. This is how we're going to scale our crit higher, and if we decide to take a shield here, we'll lose a decent bit of damage, but block is in such a good spot right now that I would say if you have no issues with damage, perhaps try taking a shield instead. As far as the amulet goes, it's crit chance and crit damage. Everything else is to fill. You really need spirit as well because we're taking so many auras. So getting Spirit on the neck piece allows us to also take a little less elsewhere. So the body armor is another place where I get Spirit. I'm also getting some life and ES from this and some reses. Honestly, taking Aventers is not completely necessary. I just need it for the Spirit. And I also had rolled this a really, really long time back, so I've just been holding on to it. Give some rarity. Cast speed, reses, life on the ring is always good. Chaos damage percentage increase is also a mod option. For the belt, you can opt for a second charm slot and then put stun or chaos in there. That's going to give you an additional defensive layer, I'd say. Otherwise, just fill with whatever. I got a massive stun threshold belt, which helps me, just avoid getting stunned. Finally, on gloves, crit damage, and boots, just get move speed and fill reses and life as needed. Overall, this build has close to 100% rarity, which is kind of nice. It's pseudo magic fine. I wouldn't call it really magic fine anymore. I had to opt into more damage, such as crit damage and crit chance crit damage on the amulet. So I gave up some rarity there. But overall, it's kind of worth it. Quality of life wise, Mana Flask, if you can get a gain charges per second, that's always good for bossing because you're going to be running out of mana with this build, even with the best efforts invested into it. So as far as some alternatives go, in the anointment section, I'm anointing this node down here, which reduces my maximum mana but gives me 35% crit chance, which is 3 of these small nodes, and I think it's worthwhile just to get really close to 100% crit. Alternatively, if you're having mana issues, speccing Ether Flow is pretty nice. You're almost always going to be moving around anyway, so you'll be regenning quite a bit, and that could potentially solve your mana regen issues on bosses if need be. Some other things you could anoint if you have the money is Enhanced Barrier, that's very expensive, or any of these crit nodes over here, which are also pretty solid, mainly these two. Otherwise, for boots, you can actually opt to play Corpse Weight. I don't think they are nerfed yet, but they create the toxic gas from corpses whenever you take steps. Those boots are insanely overtuned, and if you're able to fit it on your build without dropping really any reses out of cap, I would highly recommend trying them out. They're slow, but they do a lot of damage. This is probably going to be the final build video for this build, but some things that can be done to make the build even better is actually getting, 5 mod jewels. So, for instance, this is not really a good 5th mod, the chill duration, but if you were to hit something like spell damage or anything crazy like that, that would be a very valuable jewel for this build and can scale your damage even further. And I'm probably going to be doing that and corrupting jewels and whatnot for the foreseeable future. On top of that, a slightly better wand with better rolls on the percent damage stats is also another place of increase. And you can also get cast speed instead of mana regen and solve mana regen through other means. I think that overall this build excels in farming T15 maps and upwards. I don't really struggle with surviving too much. Some breaches plus delirium can be kind of sketchy, and some bosses will just take a little bit longer to die when it's daily layered. But I don't really have any problem with bosses outside of delirium. I think that it's a very solid build that you can get started pretty early, and it really does a good job killing rares early on without as much investment. But with this much investment, I no longer really have to even click Contagion on rares. I just go up and I just Hexblast them and they die. And that's kind of the quality of life. This is like pretty much a 1-button build, 2 buttons on a single target, and everything else is just kind of extra damage that you don't really even need to press. But yeah, overall, hope this was a helpful build guide. I know it's pretty brief, but I'll have a Mobalytics link with some other explanations if you prefer a written version. And until next time, ciao.